just introduce yourself, and if you could give a little background about Proud to Play as well for those who are tuning in and might not know what that is and what you do.
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Ryan Storr. I'm a lecturer in sport development at Western Sydney University. I did my PhD down in Melbourne. That led me to co-found Proud to Play with James Cato about 4.5 years ago now. And we set up Proud to Play to basically encourage LGBT people to play sport and exercise as a sport for development charity. So we aim to work with the sports sector and the LGBT community to try and increase opportunities for people to be active, but also to raise awareness around LGBT inclusion in the Victorian sports sector especially. And then we started off really small, and then it kind of grew larger, and we had a lot more programs. We work with sports around education, and recently we were made an official registered sporting body, like a peak organisation in Victoria for LGBT inclusion.
Yeah, awesome. And I did have a read on the website, and I guess it's been quite a big 3 years for the organisation. How has your role changed, I guess, since founding it to what it is now, with a lot more people on board rather than just yourself?
Yeah, so originally we started it all as volunteers, and myself and James were the co-founders, and then we both kind of stepped back a little bit more because our intention was always to kind of build it up and then let other people take over. So my kind of role now, I'm the vice president on the board, so I kind of just help from a strategic level. So I help kind of bridge the gap between some of the research and practice.
Yeah, awesome. And I was interested in that. See that you guys do a lot of research work for other organisations such as Football Victoria. I guess that's notable for us from a soccer background. Does Proud to Play do the actual research, or do you develop the research frameworks for those organisations to then go off and collect that data?
So, like, for example, with the Football Victoria project, we actually ran the project and delivered it in terms of the research, because most with a lot of research and policy projects out there and recommendations, and ultimately they just sit on the shelf or a policy document that is not enacted on the internet in a PDF. So we try and work with the sports organisations to actually breathe life into the findings and the recommendations. Some of the work that I've done, there's not often a lot of malice or ill intent around this. It's just they have no idea. They've maybe never met an LGBT plus person. They've never engaged with it. They don't understand it. So it's quite a foreign concept for them. So they just need a little bit of support and this hand-holding really to help them engage in this area.
In terms of sports research in academia, it's been noted by other sports researchers I've spoken to as well that there's the frameworks to critically interpret things and to have these ideas, but sometimes then there's a bit of a bridge to cross when it comes to practically implementing things on the other side of things. And I'm just interested if you've ever found that in your own work, to what extent you might agree with that sort of critique. I guess it extends to academia more broadly as well, but yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. Look, it's a challenge, especially as a kind of researcher and advocate. I guess from a research perspective, I'm quite big and heavy on research dissemination, so working to try and implement the findings. So it's often trying to work with the sports to try and think about how it betters their organisation. So often working in the business sense. So the business case for LGBT diversity is quite important in this respect. And it's kind of thinking about, especially in the research design, how you actually embed and design the project so the dissemination part is actually part of the work. So it's kind of showing that sports organisations will benefit when they engage with the research findings, because ultimately, especially from my perspective, I give them to make their organisation better. So they should be able to learn from them.
I know you've spoken about this quite extensively recently about COVID-19 and the impact that's going to have on sports clubs. I guess sometimes these things can seem like an add-on and something you can do if you have the means, rather than something that you need to embed within the organisation and ongoing practice. But I just wonder if you could give maybe just a taster, because there's lots of stuff that people can refer to if they want to know more about how you think COVID is going to affect organisations engaging in LGBT plus issues, and what sort of, I guess maybe just that you don't need to go into solutions because that's a really big question.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think we've already seen that diversity inclusion broadly has kind of been pushed off the agenda. Women's teams have stopped. Diversity inclusion positions in sports organisations have been chopped with no kind of future whether they'll come back. So I think that shows how diversity inclusion more broadly is valued within sports organisations. It is seen as a luxury and add-on. And unfortunately, we actually know from some of the research that LGBT sits at kind of the bottom of the pile often. So when I did some research for cricket, we got respondents to rank what they thought was an area of priority and importance within cricket. And LGBT inclusion was at the bottom of that compared to like women and girls and Indigenous diversity. So we know, and we have an evidence base that shows that it's kind of already at the bottom of the pile as such. And then obviously COVID-19 has come, and I think it's going to make it even more difficult, because ultimately one of the reasons why people don't engage in this space is because of resources. So now that there's even less finite resources, I think it's going to push it even off the agenda. So it's going to be really important. And I guess it's kind of concerning as well, because ultimately sport can be discriminatory and it can be a bad thing, but it can also be a good thing. So we need to really start thinking about how we can use sport as a positive tool to address wider social outcomes, such as homophobia and inclusion of LGBT plus people in society. So let's start using sport as a tool to actually, post-pandemic, to try and help LGBT people, whether it's social isolation, mental health concerns. We can actually use sport as part of this community regeneration and helping LGBT people kind of get back and how to address a range of health inequalities, whether it be physical, mental health, social health.
Yeah, awesome. And I guess touching on that sort of idea of like engagement with LGBT issues, like issues around racism and that sort of thing. There's a note in a sentence in the P2P impact report: LGBTI plus inclusion in sport cannot be achieved alone. It cannot be achieved in one-off gestures. And I think that conversation comes up more broadly every year when Pride starts happening, and it's like, oh, you've put a rainbow on your stuff, that's so nice of you, but what else are you doing? So I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on that, and where we're at in sport with, I guess, Pride, and then going past Pride.
So it's basically the difference between attitudes and behaviours. So I did some recent research with the state sport and organisation. What we found was that generally there are kind of supportive and accepting attitudes towards LGBT inclusion, and many people who work in sport think that it's the right thing to do, and that work needs to be undertaken to kind of address historical inequalities around homophobia, etc. However, it kind of stops at the attitudinal level, and often these administrators, for example, their supportive attitudes aren't reinforced with behaviours. It basically says, I support this and I have a positive attitude, but I'm not willing to do anything about it. So what we need to start doing in the sports sector is looking at how we convert these attitudes into behaviours, because ultimately it's good to have a supportive attitude, but that's not necessarily going to enact all these changes that we want to see happen.
It was noted in our previous Pride video that whilst it's fair for us to say that MUSC is a welcoming space for lesbian and bi and gay people, that doesn't extend. We can't include trans people, intersex people, or gender diverse folks in that group. I suppose, what would your first baby step recommendation be to clubs perhaps who do have that segregation in terms of gender, in terms of tackling that issue?
So there are instances across sport when we can classify against ability and also weight, different categories, whether it be boxing, sailing, all that type of stuff, especially martial arts based things. But in terms of moving forward, we want LGBT plus people to play sport and engage with it. Now, because so many have had negative experiences, we need to have participation programs. So let's say soccer, for example, the one that you mentioned. We need to think about how do we get people starting to play soccer from a participation level. So from a Pride to Play perspective, we partner with these organisations like Football Victoria, and we would run an introduction participation programme. Often there, you do not necessarily need to do it a men's and women's team. You do it basically on inviting people, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, to come and play football. Because when you're learning the basics and when you're playing at the very low level of community participation, it's not at a level where there'll be any real differences between men and women in that respect, and anyone who sits outside that gender binary. It's basically around the skills and playing it. So maybe down the track you do need to have some considerations around that, but that doesn't affect that many people. Like, not many people are elite athletes in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, awesome. And we're really excited. We did get a grant to run an all gender series, like game series at the end of the season, but that's further down the track once COVID sort of settles and we know what the football landscape's going to look like. And you did touch on this earlier. Black Lives Matter is a big talking point at the moment, and protests are happening. And I've noticed, it's been noted that Pride is about protest. Like, that's the origin of Pride and why we have Pride. It was about these riots that happened. And I guess if you feel comfortable, it would be good to hear your thoughts on that connection between protest and Pride. I ask you because you're articulate and you know things, so it would be good to hear it. You know what I mean? Like, and that also that relationship between LGBT rights and fighting racism and anti-racism as well.
Yeah, look, it's one thing I will say is often people don't often have the words or the language to speak about this type of thing. So I think in terms of what as a community we can do, I know there's been some articles, and I know a researcher, Bronwyn Carlson, who's an Indigenous researcher, has done some good work with some other colleagues around things like that, and sexual racism, and this idea of it's just a preference, which links back to kind of colonization and Western modes of beauty and things like that. But I think there definitely it's definitely a good conversation that's happening, because it talks about this role of an ally to basically anyone from a minority group and histories of exclusion. And to your final point about histories of exclusion and protest, there are lots of different approaches to social change. Some of them you literally need to get to the streets and protest. So I think from my perspective, it's interesting. I think you need a kind of a range of approaches. Sometimes, especially around homophobia in sport, nothing kind of really happens. People just give the lip service. So sometimes you kind of have to go in and protest and kind of agitate to try and get change. And I think this, hopefully, even just from some of the conversations that were happening on Q&A last night, racism in sport has been ongoing for many years, and the Adam Goods case is terrible, but it kind of just gets swept away. So I think now, hopefully, the sports sector will have to actually address the problem of racism, and I think that will help other forms of diversity and inclusion, whether it be homophobia, transphobia, etc. So it'll be interesting to see how it kind of all pans out. But I don't think sports organisations can get away any longer from digging their head in the sands and just turning a blind eye, because I think, as the protests have kind of showed, the general public won't accept it anymore. And at the end of the day, they're businesses. It's bad for business to have an organisation that is discriminatory or does not have inclusive values and practices.
And I guess when it comes back to people who are customers at those businesses, you have to make it bad for business and say, I'm not giving you my money if you're not going to respond to these concerns.
As you kind of alluded to, the LGBT plus community are pretty switched on now around suddenly like corporate campaign, things like that, where people will just put a rainbow on and think for the month they're going to do stuff, but they don't actually do anything. And it's like, take our money. Like, I think the LGBT communities are across that, and they will call it out when they see it. And the same goes to sport. Just having a pride round, which is it's a good step, don't get me wrong, but a pride round is not substitute for having inclusive practices for LGBT people all year round.
I think going from big picture back to yourself, you do wear a number of different hats, as you touched on in your introduction. So I was wondering how do these, we just say that at the club, you've got 3 different hats on. So how did your different roles as a researcher, policymaker, sports fan and player as well, how do they inform each other?
Let's say as a player for tennis, it means I have the opportunity to use my platform to work with organisations or work with my club to kind of help them and to maybe introduce changes that they might not have considered around LGBT inclusion. So often I try and speak out where possible around trans and gender diverse inclusion. I've done a lot of work with parents of gender diverse children, so I kind of have not necessarily a soft spot, but I will always speak out for trans and gender diverse children in particular, and especially in sporting contexts, because they're young and vulnerable. So to be targeted with abuse at such a young age, I think is absolutely terrible, especially, for example, the Australian newspaper has a bit of a crusade against them. So I know a lot of their families and parents who just want the best for their young people. So that's pretty discouraging. So often, where possible, I use my kind of platform and try and think about directing people to inclusive sports. So interestingly, I've done a lot of work with cricket, but I never was a fan, whereas I've suddenly become a fan because I've done a lot of work with the Sydney Sixers, and they're a fantastic club. They literally, I do very minimal stuff. They do it all and I support them. They're the ones bringing up with ideas. They're often getting in touch, and it's so refreshing. And it's a really nice organisation to be in climate. So when I go to the Big Bash matches, like I never thought I would go to cricket matches. It's such a welcoming space. It's a really nice space. And I think the Big Bash, and because it's a family kind of vibe, I think that's the way forward, because families don't want to be seeing discrimination and abuse and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And there was a webinar I attended with some folks from Lose FC in the UK, and they made a good point in terms of sometimes the fan base might not be reflective of the broader community because the broader community doesn't realise that, or doesn't feel safe or comfortable attending a particular sporting match or game or that sort of thing. So it's sort of that if you build it, they will come idea of creating the space, and then the fans will follow. Yeah, and I guess this is just for my own, I guess, selfish reasons, but how did you end up in sports research? What was the journey that ended up with you doing your PhD in Australia? And
gosh, I literally fell into it. So I did I went to Loughborough University, which is a very sporty university in the UK, geography and sports science, sport leisure management, and then got a graduate tutor position at a university around sport development and coaching. So that was my background. And then kind of a scholarship came up, did my PhD here, did that, and then it kind of fell into that. So I enjoy doing the research because I'm quite an inquisitive person. And I think it's really important to have evidence-based data to inform programs and policies and things like that. And because as a gay man, I kind of have a reflection, a affinity to it, I guess. I know what people feel like, and I know what homophobia looks like and feels like, etc. So for me, it's really important that our voices are heard and our community is heard. It's good that we can have heterosexual allies, but when you have heterosexual people writing about homophobia, not that there's anything wrong with that, but I just think the same way women's voices need to be heard within feminist research, it's important to have actual LGBT people in these positions, because to be honest with you, there aren't many gay male sport researchers. I know most of them. So we've got to think, well, why aren't gay men, for example, being attracted to sport and researching it?
It's a bit of a basic question, but do you have any role models, LGBT or otherwise, in sport or sports research?
Yeah, so I have a lot. Not necessarily, some of them are allies, but so Dr. Bridie O'Donnell at the Office of Women in Sport,
yeah,
like her leadership in this area around women in sport, but also talking about LGBT issues. It's amazing. Like, I admire her, I know her, and I just think like she's wonderful. Mel Jones, wonderful cricketer. She's in the board of Cricket Australia. She's amazing. To be honest with you, most of them are women in sport. Like, there are some men I admire, but I just think, especially the women's movement here in Australia, like Australia is one of the best places for sport for women. And I think the recent Women's World Cup shows you how much demand there is for it. And I think by kind of leading the way, and all the brilliant women who are doing fabulous work, whether it be like Ladies Who League, Mary, there are so many wonderful women doing great work and putting themselves out there to try and change. And it's helping me do the work that I do, because I can follow in their footsteps. And like, we really need to get women in sport right before we can do anything else. Like, we're only just starting to really get on top of that. So I think when we are kind of getting on top of that and really embedding women across the sports sector, then I think that will help people like myself in the work that I do around LGBT inclusion.
Yeah, awesome. And it's, I guess, women in sport researchers as well. Really awesome community.
Totally. There's some fabulous ones. I often work with a lot of them. So Ruth Jeans, Emma Sherry, Simone Folliger. There are so many good researchers, and I'm lucky that I get to work with them. So it's great.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and your insight. And I just wanted to say, if there's any resources that you wanted for us to pass on alongside the interview, definitely send them through to Kat for further reading for people who are really keen. That would be great, because I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. You know, there's so much out there and so much that people can read and learn more from. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. Was there anything you wanted to add, or?
No, just that. Thank you for doing this. And I think LGBT inclusion in sport is becoming a lot more topical now. So it's great that these conversations are happening and that there's awareness, because I think the sports sector will benefit when more people can play and engage with it.